everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am talking about the pros and cons of traditional publishing. So the disclaimer for you right up front is I am a traditionally published author, so that of course is my background and area of expertise, which is why I'm not exactly the right person to tell you the pros and cons of self-publishing, though I do have a whole video about why I chose to pursue traditional publishing instead of self-publishing that's pretty circumspect and does kind of examine, some of the differences between the two. But this video is all just kind of laying out for you the specific pros and the specific cons and what you might want to consider if you are thinking about traditional publishing. Pro number one is distribution. So traditional publishing more or less guarantees you to a certain degree distribution in bookstores, libraries, and schools, or the library and school market, but especially bookstores. Traditional publishers have long-standing relationships with the primary distributors to bookstores and with bookstores themselves, and so they're able to sell directly to bookstores, both the large chains like Barnes & Noble or Books A Million, as well as indie bookstores. They are experts at getting books placement on the shelves and as well as good placement on the floor. And with the school and library market, this is something that a lot of people don't even think about, but the school and library market can actually be huge for authors, especially if you're publishing in the kidlit middle grade and certain types of YA space. And so traditional publishers have entire teams whose job it is to promote and get books distributed in the school and library market, which sometimes can make or break a book. With self-publishing, there's simply a much steeper uphill climb when it comes to getting your book distributed widely and in this manner. Bookstore distribution is becoming more possible for self-publishing, but it's still a lot harder, and it's something that you have to put more funds toward up front, which I'm gonna cover traditional publishing and cost in some of the other points, but that is just something to consider. And in many cases, it's almost impossible to get into libraries, as a lot of the librarians I've talked to, they're not able to order self-published books for their library, or they don't want to. Pro number two is about money. You don't have to pay anything up front to be traditionally published. Money in traditional publishing always flows to the author, so you don't have to worry about essentially upfront investments. You don't have to pay for an editor or a cover or marketing or any of those things. You could theoretically spend more or less nothing and be traditionally published. Though I will talk a little later, again in other points, about slight exceptions to this, but generally speaking, the upfront costs for self-publishing are much higher than for traditional publishing, because with self-publishing, you are responsible for funding the entire endeavor, including literally paying to have your book printed or put on a platform, which your traditional publisher will always take care of for you. Pro number three is the advance system in traditional publishing. Most traditional publishers, the larger ones especially, pay an advance against sales. So you might have heard about these. This is essentially what the publisher is willing to pay you for your book. They pay it to you in a series of payments. It's not like one lump sum. I have multiple videos all about how advances work in traditional publishing, which I will link to down below. In general, I'll link to a lot of videos down below in the description box that kind of overlap with some of these pros and cons that I've already discussed in the channel, so you can learn more. But advances, so for example, your publisher might pay you $50,000 in advance for your book. This is paid to you in installments when you sign your contract, when you turn in your book, when your book is published, and then it's an advance against the sales of your book, and if you meet the amount of the advance, then you start earning royalties. Now, a benefit of advances is it's a guaranteed sum that you know you will be receiving for your book, so it's a guarantee of an amount that you're going to earn off of your book. Pro number four is that you as the author don't have to wear all the hats. As I mentioned, tied in with the money piece, if you are self-publishing, you are responsible for everything. You are a one-person publishing house. But when you go traditional publishing, you are, working with a whole team of people to get everything done and get your book out in the world. So you don't have to worry about being a good salesperson or being really good at marketing or publicity or cover design or even, kind of the nuts and bolts of editing. Someone else is, different people are doing all of those things for you. And again, you don't have to pay them to do those things because the money flows to you. So if you're someone who doesn't have the wide breadth of skill set that is required for self-publishing, traditional publishing can be attractive because you really only have to focus on the writing for the most part. Pro number 5 is all of the things that a traditional publisher can do for you, such as printing ARCs, the marketing team getting the word out about your book, including sending out those ARCs, the publicity team doing their job. Publicity team also sends out ARCs, but they also submit your book for reviews, submit you for awards. They pitch you to publications like USA Today or BuzzFeed or Bustle to get them to write about your book. That is their entire job. And because traditional publishers have a lot of clout, they are better able to get you picked up for marketing and publicity, reviews, and so on. And I personally think that ARCs alone are one of the biggest pros under this pro of traditional publishing, because again, they bear the cost to print these advanced reader copies of your book and get them out to start generating word of mouth. That's generally not an expense that you can incur in self-publishing because it's double printing your book. Now, of course, you can distribute e-ARCs. That is something that you can do in self-publishing, but especially if you follow Bookstagram and BookTube and those sorts of spaces, there's a real advantage to physically printing an ARC. It is a special tool that helps in building buzz for your book. Those ARCs also go to those awards committees and review committees and so on. So these are avenues and access that traditional publishers pretty much exclusively have. Pro number 6 is, that clout. Traditional publishers offer, in essence, vetting for you as a writer, as a book, and almost name brand value. While the average consumer doesn't know all the names of the publishers, they kind of are usually able to spot a professionally designed cover. Some of them are familiar with the logos of the publishers, whether that's HarperCollins or Penguin Random House or Simon & Schuster, and they are able to look and go, oh, okay, this is a legit book, for lack of a better word. And I know that this isn't fair. It honestly isn't fair. But that is legitimately a pro of traditional publishing, that essentially because you went through the gauntlet and were kind of, vetted by professionals in publishing who then professionally put together and put out your book, it kind of does a lot of the work for you with potential readers in just the struggle of getting them to consider reading and buying your book. Traditional publishing goes a long way to just kind of get people to give you a shot. Pro number 7 of traditional publishing is that to get traditionally published, you pretty much almost always need a literary agent. And there are serious pros to having a literary agent because you essentially have a business partner and advocate who takes care of things on your behalf so that you don't have to worry about all of that kind of nitty-gritty business stuff and the finance stuff. They first of all, they get your book to the publishers, they get them to buy it, they negotiate a contract that has the most favorable terms for you, the author. Then they also operate as a go-between. If there are any issues with your publisher, you have this business partner and advocate on your side. They also manage all of the money. The publishers pay your agency, and then they forward the funds onto you. So they also then provide you with the tax documentation that you need. It's basically your agent is a business partner, and that can be really, really useful to have, especially again with wearing all the hats. You don't necessarily want to have to do all the business stuff. You want to write books. Having an agent is honestly invaluable. And the 8th pro, which again kind of ties into other ones, I think you're probably noticing a theme. It is honestly easier to get into events and festivals, do author appearances, book signings, and so on if you are traditionally published. Half of this is just, again, the clout and the vetting aspect. You would be amazed. I've been kind of doing some event planning for myself, trying to do things, and I wasn't able to make contacts and bookings as an individual, but all I had to do was ask my publicist to submit the same request and it was approved quickly. For events at, essentially major bookstores, festivals, having my publicist submit me to book festivals, I honestly think is the reason that I was accepted, because these were, I got invitations through my publisher, who is well respected and known in the industry. The other half of it on the kind of bookstore and book supply side is I've definitely heard stories, cases, this happens with self-published authors, but also authors with smaller publishers with less clout, or smaller publishers with what I kind of side-eye them on their business practices, but I've heard of cases where authors have serious trouble booking events at bookstores because the bookstores aren't able to get books from the publisher that are returnable, which is a whole industry thing that I'm not going to go into in detail. But when you have a traditional publisher and a major one who has good relationships with bookstores, it's easy for the bookstore to say yes, because they know that they can get a stock of your books to sell at the event, but any books that aren't sold are very easy to return to the publisher. This is a built-in aspect of the traditional publishing industry, which again ties into pro number one with the distribution. Self-published and authors with smaller publishers who have really iffy policies in terms of supply and return. Sometimes we'll find that bookstores say no, or they say yes, and the author has to fund the supply of books that they bring to their event, which is kind of a hassle or can be a real obstacle to doing these events. And finally, the ninth pro of traditional publishing is the potential for big rewards. When you go with traditional publishing, especially if you debut as a traditionally published author, you have a much bigger shot at breaking out and essentially being really successful as an author, selling a lot of copies, getting your name out there, and making a splash as an author so that you can establish a career. Traditional publishing gives you a real running start at that, a shot at that. There's still lots of, crapshoot involved in traditional publishing, but if you're looking for essentially lower risk, higher reward, traditional publishing offers a pretty good shot. But it is not all sunshine and roses. There are flip sides to all of these, and so there are some legitimate cons to traditional publishing that you need to consider. The first big con is gatekeepers. There are gatekeepers that are inherent to traditional publishing, and therefore hurdles that you have to jump over just to get to the end stage of having your book published. The first gatekeepers are, of course, literary agents. You basically can't get editors at large traditional publishers to even look at your book unless you have literary agent representation. This can be really, really frustrating for a lot of aspiring writers because you have to write your book, you have to revise it into good shape, which you should really do anyway. And then you have to master the querying process. You have to reach out and find an agent. Then your agent puts you on submission and you have to hope that a publisher wants to buy it. And then if they want to buy it, you have to hope that they can convince everyone else at the publisher to buy it. And then once they've bought it, you have to hope that everything goes well and lots of bookstores pick it up and you get marketing support. There are many, many hurdles to jump over to get to that end one that I essentially covered in the last pro of, breaking out and doing really well as an author. Lots and lots of hurdles that you do have to jump over. Con number two is you have very little control over pretty much everything. I have a whole video on things you don't have control over in traditional publishing. So a huge con for a lot of people is that relinquishing of control. You have to let go of control over the story in many cases. You are always the writer, but you have to work with an editor on their input to kind of mold the book into something that is both yours and the publisher's. You have to let go of control of things like your cover and the marketing and publicity and events. So much of it is out of your control because you're relying on other people to do their job, and also just sometimes fate. The fates, luck. And for a lot of people, that lack of control, especially on the editorial and marketing side, is really, really frustrating. Though I do encourage you to then think about that pro that I mentioned about marketing and access. Your traditional publisher definitely has more access than you do, and just because you have control over things in self-publishing doesn't mean you can control everything. The next con that is worth mentioning is because you have no control over most things, and certainly usually not over your cover, you may end up hating it. Now, of course, this does fall under you have to give up control, but I mention this as its own con because this is a deal breaker for a lot of people. Ultimately, I will urge you to consider that usually traditional publishers know what they're doing when it comes to cover, so just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's not a great cover that will sell your book, but that is definitely a con worth mentioning. The fourth con of traditional publishing is you have to share in the profits of the book. Now, there's, trade-offs here. You get your advance money and then your publisher does the lion's share of the work to get the book out in the world so that you don't have to do all of those roles and wear those hats, but then you have to share the profit. I hear a lot with individuals who are comparing self-publishing to traditional publishing is that traditionally published authors get such a small percentage of, each sale, which yes is true, but this tends to be offset by the higher advances. And in cases where publishers don't give you an advance, it's all royalties, you're able to negotiate higher percentages on those royalties. But it is a con that you only get so much of each sale should you start to earn royalties, and you have to pay 15% of that to your agent. You pay 15% of your advance to your agent as well. Now again, I would argue, per the pros list, that your agent earns their commission by being your business partner and your advocate. But it would be remiss of me not to mention this as a con because it is a con for a lot of people. And I will say, there are cases where if your book is going to do gangbusters in self-publishing, you shouldn't do profit sharing via traditional publishing because it's not the best business decision. So it is a con to consider. The fifth con to traditional publishing is simply that it takes forever. Traditional publishing is a game for the very patient. Now, there are good payoffs and dividends to the longer publishing process in traditional publishing and to the patience that you will demonstrate in pursuing traditional publishing, but it can still be really, really maddening. First of all, because you cannot necessarily control how long it's going to take you to get through those gatekeepers. It could be an indeterminate length of time between, working on your book or books and then getting an agent and then selling it to a publisher. And then once you do sell it to a publisher, it takes 18 months to 2 years for you to see your book on the shelf. In some extreme cases, it can take as much as 3 years. I've also heard of some horror stories where it takes 4 years. But then there are also cases like me, from sale to bookshelf, 13 months. So sometimes publishing doesn't take too long, but for the most part, it's definitely a longer process because so much care is put into working on the book, and they also purposely leave lead time so that their sales, marketing, and publicity teams can do their job to build buzz for your book and get it out in the world. The sixth big con to traditional publishing is you are going to get a lot of rejection. You're going to experience a lot of rejection at the various stages because of the gatekeeping and so on. This can be really, really demoralizing and upsetting for a lot of writers. You will get rejected at the query stage, you'll get rejected at the publisher stage, either just by the editor, or even then the editor loves it, but the acquisitions meeting says no, the people at the acquisitions meeting, so sales and marketing said no to you. And then honestly, you'll go out in the world and you'll be rejected in the form of reviews or not getting into events, etc. But I will say, to that point, you're gonna experience those same rejections if you do self-publish. You just skip the rejections on the front end, on the agent and the publisher side. Personally, I think it's a good thing to learn how to healthily deal with and process rejection because it's just a natural part of any consumer culture. When you put a product out into the world, when you put anything creative, anything that you've created out there, people are going to have various opinions of it. So it's a big con, though, for a lot of people. And I think you're probably noticing a trend with a lot of these cons for traditional publishing. Obviously, I decided to pursue traditional publishing, so all of these cons have nuance and a flip side that I think are worth considering. And I mean, so do the pros. Most of these pros and cons go together and they mirror each other. And finally, the seventh con for traditional publishing is that honestly, your book can get lost in the shuffle. Even with all of this, and you're with a big publisher and they paid you good money for your book, and so on and so on, the playing field is honestly not level, and there's a lot that isn't cool or fair about traditional publishing, and specifically when it comes to marketing and publicity. Now, I do want to squash the rumor that no one gets marketing or publicity from their publisher anymore. You have to do everything yourself, especially if you're a debut. That is simply not true, and I speak as a debut author with an incredibly supportive publisher who's done some amazing marketing and publicity for me. I adore them, and I've been incredibly happy with my entire debut experience, but I must acknowledge that there is a sliding scale. Some people absolutely get way more support from their publisher than others, and it is possible to get lost, especially at larger publishers that simply publish a lot of books. This is definitely a con. It's because you are out of control of things when it comes to traditional publishing, so these things can happen. Now, there are steps that you can take to mitigate a situation where you realize you're just not going to be getting that marketing and publicity support from your publisher, but that is a whole other topic for another day, and of course I have videos on it, so I'm gonna link to that down below. But I think that is a legitimate con of pursuing traditional publishing, that it's kind of a crapshoot in a lot of ways of, you entrust this publisher to publish your beautiful book, and will they or will they not do it justice? I do think most of the time they do. Most people who take the gamble and do traditional publishing, it does pay off, or it can pay off in terms of setting you up for a long-term career. But it's not all sunshine and roses, and it's definitely not the right path for everyone and every kind of book. Certain books are just honestly better suited to self-publishing, and certain books are better suited to traditional publishing, because there are pros and cons to both. So that's it, just some of the pros and cons of traditional publishing. I hope this was helpful. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, and let me know down below in the comments any questions you have or any pros and cons that you can think of for traditional publishing. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, welcome. I love new subscribers. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week, all about young adult fiction, writing it, and of course the industry being traditionally published, marketing, craft, reading, books, and so on. Thank you so much for watching, and as always everyone, happy writing.